Hey guys, welcome back to part 2 of this Megascans for RenderMan walkthrough. In part 1, we took a few different assets from the Megascans library and set them up in RenderMan for Maya. In part 2, we're going to expand on that and actually build a scene using nothing but Megascans assets. It's amazing how much you can accomplish using only the library that they provide, and the production quality you can achieve in a fairly short amount of time. So I'm going to jump into Maya, and you'll see in the viewport I have already imported a handful of different assets into my scene. I set them up the same way that we went over in part 1. I chose 5 different grass and plant variations and one rock rib that I've imported that we also set up in part 1. So I'm going to jump over into the bridge, and the plants that I'm using are the flowering weed plant, the nodding violet, purple plant, adds a little variation to the scene, adds some depth, some dry grass, swamp grass, this is the asset we set up in part 1, and then wild grass as well. So at the beginning of any project, it's good to look at a lot of different reference, and one thing that I noticed when browsing is the variety of different grasses when you look at a grassy field. So I chose 3 different varieties of grasses and then 2 different plants to kind of throw in and add some variety to that. And then the mossy rock is what we set up in part 1 as well. So those are the assets I'm using. 5 plants, the rock, and then we'll actually go over and grab another one here in a little bit to set up for the ground. So to start, I want to pull up what I was able to come up with when I was thinking about doing this demo. This is a scene that I did that it's really a lot more simple than it looks. We have the 5 different plant varieties that I outlined already. We have the mustard, we have some of the purple, violet, nodding violet plants, and then we have the 3 grass varieties. Now we're distributing them using Maya's mesh system. We have 2 instances of the rock rib that we've already set up, and then the ground is just a simple poly plane that we've assigned a dirt material to. So really it's very simple. We're going to step through this. This is kind of our end goal, what we want to achieve in this part. I'm going to move fairly quickly. Feel free to ask any questions in the comments below, and I'll try to get back to you, but I want to keep this demo kind of to a reasonable length. So with that, we're going to jump in. I'm going to, just for demonstrations, I had these scattered so you could see them, but I'm going to open up the attribute spreadsheet and just zero them out so they're at the origin. It's important when you're using Maya's mesh to have the transforms zeroed out, otherwise it'll affect the mesh transforms, how they're scattered. So I'm going to keep them all at the origin. You'll also notice in my scene I've structured it in such a way I have all the geometry in a group, I have a lights group and a cameras group. That's just typically how I organize my scenes, and it keeps things clean. So to start, we're going to create a poly plane. I'm going to scale it up. It's fairly large, something like 3500. Just to kind of get the scope. So the plants the assets from the Megascans library typically are in real world scale. So that'll give you kind of a good reference on how to scale the rest of your scene. So I'm going to add some subdivisions to this, 100 and 100. And then one little trick I like to do to get some deformation to the ground plane, instead of maybe using the sculpt tool and painting hills or sculpting different hills and valleys, there's a cool little website I like to go to called terrain.party. It's a website where you can download height maps from real world geography. So you can drag this little blue rectangle wherever you want. Default's over in Europe, but I'm over in the States. So I'm going to take a height map over from Utah, which is where I am. Let's just say this area. I'm going to reduce the size, and you can just click download. You can call it whatever. And you're going to actually get a little zip package. We go to downloads. You can see you get these cool height maps. So this is actually the geography in the area that I've selected in that blue rectangle. So I can go and deform my polyplane using real world data, and I don't have to go in and sculpt. It's actually pretty neat. So I have already downloaded one that I'd like to use using the same method. So what I'm going to do is in the Hypershade, using a file texture, just a Maya file, I'm going to open up that. So I'm going to go to the source images, terrain. So these are the height maps, and I'd like to use the blurred out one. I don't need the, I mean, these are canyons from in the local mountains nearby. I don't need that granular of detail. I need just wavy hills is kind of what I'm after. So after I have that, I need to deform this using this texture. So we can go up to the, I'm in the modeling drop down, deform, and there's going to be a texture option. So with the plane selected, deform texture, and it's going to attach a texture deformer handle. And in that, in the texture deformer, you can plug in a texture. Now I just dragged and dropped from the Hypershade and plugged that in. You notice nothing changed. We actually need to step the strength up quite a bit. So if I go to say 1,000, you can see we actually have some cool displacement happening right in this polyplane. If you're not getting enough resolution, you can always add more subdivisions. This looks good for me. I just wanted some subtle wavy deformations. You'll see the edges are a little weird, so we can go in, and once we're happy with how the deformations are handling, we can double click on an outside edge, and that'll select the entire perimeter. Right, hold your control key, right click, and go to faces, and that'll select all of the outside faces, and then shift greater than to kind of expand that one row and hit delete. So now I have a plane that has some cool just undulating hills that we can work with, and it was really quick and easy to do that. In the past I may have used the sculpt tool and sculpted some different terrain, but this has become my new go-to. It's pretty quick and easy. So I'm going to call this ground. I'm going to put it in the geometry group, and I'm going to frequently save my scene, especially as we start using mesh. It can get fairly unstable, so I'm going to drag this down because we displaced it up so much. I'm going to drag it back down so we're roughly at the origin where these plants are sitting. Perfect. So now I'm going to create a camera. This is one of the first few things I do setting up a scene is I create a camera, and I kind of play with the different objects and silhouettes and see, and then I continue to refine and add details as I go. So I created a normal camera. I'm going to call it shot cam, and you'll notice it's tiny in real world scale. So in the channel box, I'm going to change the locator scale to something like 30 so we can see it. So if I look through the shot cam, I have a hotkey to do that, but you can go panels, perspective, shot cam, and I minimize the Hypershade. We're going to be looking something, I kind of liked this little valley, if you will, right here to have a pathway leading up. So I'm going to just kind of narrow something in, and for this shot I also like to or for this scene specifically, I'm going to step up the focal length to something like 45. That's typically what I like to use unless it's a super close up. I'm going to do something like that for now, but we'll be continuing to adjust this. Now if I pull up what I'm after again, you'll notice that this main rock up front is in focus. It's almost the focus of the shot, and the background is blurred. So I'd like to set up, so we have our polyplane, and I'd like to position this rock in such a way where that's going to be the focus, and my camera is going to be set, and then I'm going to fill in the mesh network around that to kind of guide the eye. But I want to set this rock first, so I'm going to grab this. I'm going to have a few copies of this, so I'm going to just number it, and I'm going to split this. So typically I have another, on my other monitor, I'll have this camera shot cam view up, and then I'll in the perspective be able to modify the positions of things in my scene. But for the sake of this recording, I'm going to do a 2-panel split on the side, because I'm still going to be working in my Hypershade. We'll do something like this so I can, it's easier to move things around in the perspective view, and then in the shot cam I can see what is happening. So I know I'm going to need to scale this up a little bit. It came in a little small, and that might be real world scale, but I think the detail is that such that we can actually scale this up and get it to look a little like it's a little bit bigger. We're going to try to, I'm just looking at the silhouette. I don't know, something like that, and then maybe see how it's intersecting with the ground here. We're looking decent. I'm thinking this might be, I might want to push this out a little farther. And this is where the tweaking begins. I mean, I'm going to try to brush through this a little quicker than I usually do. I spend a lot of time tweaking and modifying things. So if I pull up what I'm going after again, this looks close. I like that. Something like that. That might be actually sticking out a little too far. Something like that. And then we're going to have a pathway that kind of leads up and around this rock here. So that looks good. And then later on we're going to probably put one in the back just to kind of give it some dimension. So that's good. And then we're also going to later add some depth of field, and we'll key off of this rock to do that as well. So from here we're going to actually jump right into mesh at this point. So we have our focus. It's going to be this boulder, and we want this area of the terrain to be filled with the grasses that we've set up. So I'm going to open up mesh, the mesh tab here, and actually have the mesh editor stuck above my outliner up here. It's convenient and easy to access at that point. So to create a mesh network, we're going to take the wild grass first, because that's going to be kind of the base. I'm going to select all of the wild grass objects, and I'm going to do create mesh network. Now, what I'd actually like to do is just to verify, you can go over to the animation toolkit, go to the mesh menu and do the options, and make sure you have it as an instancer. I think by default it's mesh, which is actually copying the objects, which we don't want. We want instances of the objects. So we're going to call it mesh wild grass, apply and close. So now we have a mesh network of the wild grass. You'll notice these are hidden. It hides them. And in the distribute node, we're going to click on it, and distribution type we're going to change to mesh. So we want to scatter it across a mesh. It needs an input mesh to know where to scatter, what mesh to scatter it across. So I middle clicked and dragged the ground shape over into the input mesh. And now if we up the number of points, you'll see that we get it starting to scatter across. You'll also notice that these are all the same instance, or all the same variation of wild grass, which shouldn't be right. We have 5 different variations. We're only getting 1. So to do that, or to fix that, we add an ID node. and set it to random. So that way it's actually going to randomly pick one of the instances that we've selected to scatter, and you'll see that now we have a variation. Then from there, you'd like to add a random node. You'll notice that they're all oriented the same way. So in the random, it defaults these to 1, which I don't want, but we want a random 360-degree Y rotation in local scale. I was looking at it and they were tilted for some reason. But yeah, you have to change this to local, otherwise it's world scale. We'll do a little bit of random X and Z as well, just to give it some tilt. And then absolute and uniform scale, I'm going to do just a little bit of scale variation. So this is a 0.2 variation in the scale. You can see you can drive this up. You'll get some that get bigger and some that stay the same. I'm going to stick it right around 0.2. It just gives a little bit of variation there. Now I'm going to jump back to the distribute node. Obviously 100 points is not nearly enough. We need quite a bit more. We can jump it up to 1,000, see what we look like. Still not nearly enough. Let's go 10,000. Now we're looking a little better. Well, one thing you notice is we're scattered, or we have grass everywhere on this plane, which is great, but we're only doing a still frame shot with the camera focused, you know, in this direction. And if I actually select my shot cam and click on the frustum, you can see this is what I'm looking at in my shot. I don't need all of this back here bogging down my scene. So we can actually optimize this a bit by adding a visibility node to the top of this stack. And in the Frustum filtering, we're going to enable Frustum filtering. Now nothing happened. Again, it needs a reference, or it needs a camera frustum. I'm going to click and drag, middle click and drag the shot cam over, and you'll see now the visibility is only based off of this, which is cool. But you also notice something kind of not ideal is that it gets cut off very close to the frustum edges, so that you can actually expand the border of the frustum where it actually filters them. And I almost always have to do this. At one, the edges of the frustum, you won't get, say, plants that are just off frame that maybe have a leaf or two sticking in. Those will get chopped off, which we don't want. So I'm going to set this to, say, 2. You could even go maybe 1.5, just to make sure that you're getting all of the vegetation in the areas at the edges of the frame that you need. I'm actually going to set it to 2 because I noticed that I do like it close to the camera frame as well there. So in all of our networks, we're going to set up the same visibility filtering here. Alright, so that's the wild grass. And so far in the shot cam, it looks not so good because we need this pathway cut out of it. And we'll do that here in a sec. I'm going to set up a few different mesh networks, and then we're going to do the pathway here in a moment. So the next one I'm going to do is the swamp grass. I'm going to select all of the swamp grass. I'm going to create a mesh network. I'm going to name it mesh swamp grass. I'm going to call it, or I'm going to change it to a mesh. Plug in the ground as the mesh, and then we're just going to add several variations or several points to the field of the swamp grass. Now, one thing I don't like is that the swamp grass to me should be larger than the wild grass. It seems like the scale's a little different than I would like. So what you can do is go back to the base geometry in your scene, and if you actually scale these objects, the mesh items will scale as well. So I'm going to go to scale for all of the wild grass, and I'm going to bump it down, and you'll see how all of the mesh items scaled down. That actually looks a little better, especially with the size of the rock as well. So I actually scaled the wild grass down to 0.6. So we're gonna jump over and add the same setup of the mesh over here. We're gonna add an ID node, set that to random. We're going to add a random node. We're going to, again, change this to local, zero out the position. We're going to do random 360 degree, and a little bit of random X and Z for some tilt, and this 0.2 uniform scale for that. And then one more node, we need the visibility as well. Turn on enable Frustum Filtering and click and drag my shot cam over to there. I'm going to bump this up to 2. So you can see we're starting to get somewhere. It looks a little sparse if I'm looking at it from the top view, so we'll probably end up adding more points. But as I just start to build this, I'm going to keep them low and then add more as I need them. Alright, so we've done swamp grass, we've done wild grass. Let's just keep on going through the dry grass here. I'm going to add a network for that. We're going to call it Mash Dry Grass. Scatter it over the ground mesh, and 5,000 here. And I noticed when I initially imported the dry grass in, they were very small compared to the rest. So I'm going to just scale them up right out of the gate. I'm not going to wait to do that. Something like 2.5. Now they're kind of popping out. I like that. Obviously there's no variety at the moment, so if we add an ID node, now we're going to get all the different dry grass variations. We need to add a random node. So you'll see repetition here. This is the basic setup for a mesh network. We're going to add some randomness. We're going to fine tune the amount of points, and then we're going to keep adding different varieties of plants to make it more realistic. So we're looking good so far. And then another visibility. Frustum Filtering. Change it to 2. Starting to look pretty good. So I'm going to just do this 2 more times. I have the Nodding Violet, the periwinkle plant, and then the mustard plant. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to run through and do this real quick. Alright, so I went ahead and set up the few remaining mesh networks. I did it for the mustard plant and the periwinkle plant. The same exact way as I set up before. We have a ID random and visibility for them. And we have all of our mesh networks created at this point. So now it's up to really just tweaking the amount of them. We're going to create a pathway, and we should be able to get something pretty decent out of this. So I'm going to do a little scene cleanup. I'm going to group up all of the mesh instances and drop them in there. Now, to create a pathway, we're basically going to need to paint a black and white map for the mesh network to use as a visibility plugin. So to do that, I'm going to actually I'm going to paint right in the Maya viewport on a plane here. So to do that, and I notice I still have the texture deform handle, I'm going to go in and just delete the history on this, and that should get rid of that, so I don't need it anymore. So to paint on geometry, I'm going to duplicate this and just go ground. I'm just going to call it something different, just because you need to assign a different material to this geometry. A Lambert was fine, so I'm going to assign a Lambert to my paint ground, my ground paint. I'm going to hide the ground that we're going to be using for rendering. And with a Lambert assigned, we can go up into the texturing or rendering menu rather, texturing drop down and do the 3D paint tool. Now with that you can double click, and I'm running out of screen space, but the tool options are up here. So the first thing you need to do is assign a texture to this, and we're going to do the color channel. So I'm going to assign and edit texture. I'm going to make it 2K map. I'm going to save it just as a JPEG is fine, and assign edit textures, and you'll see what happens in the Hypershade is it actually assigns a new file texture to the color node of the material that I have assigned. And then this, as we paint, this is the texture that is going to be saved out. So we have a texture assigned. The first thing I'm going to do is basically we want everything to be a value of white, and then we're going to paint a pathway that is black that basically indicates to the mesh network, don't distribute geometry here. So we're going to flood paint the plane white, and nothing changed because I typically work with the default material option selected. So if I turn that off and hit 6 on my keyboard to load textures, you'll see that this plane is now white. Now if I were to go flood paint black, you'll see it turns black, flood paint white. So then now we're going to go and paint a black line basically where the pathway is going to be. And you'll notice in the viewport it's pretty laggy. This is because of all the mesh nodes we have loaded right now. So I'm going to turn off a few. I do want to have some just as a reference for scale. I'm going to turn off a few of those, and that'll help if I can actually click on them. Turn off the dry grass as well. So we have a few. This just gives me kind of a scale more than anything. So I'm going to pick a color of black, and then holding the B key, clicking and dragging, I'm going to size up the brush of this, and for some reason this switched over to the bump, so you saw the X on the screen. So at this point, if I were to click and drag, we can paint right on the mesh. Now I can actually, if I undo that, paint straight from the shot cam. I'm actually going to turn off the rest of the mesh networks. My computer isn't handling everything at once very well. So from here, and we should be able to see it right in the shot cam, but I don't, unfortunately. We're going to just paint right up and over. Oh, that's because I have the default material. There we go. I typically use the default material option because of the RenderMan shaders don't preview in the viewport like they should. So you can just, from here, I'm just going to paint maybe a pathway. It's going to take a few takes. It's daring to do this with a mouse and not a tablet or something, but you just take a few takes at it and see what we come up with. Something like that. That looks pretty good. I like that. And then in the perspective view, we can continue this and just do this kind of a thing just to continue. So that's going to be our pathway. And one thing I like to do, so it's not such a harsh line right here, is I'm going to go back with white and a smaller brush. And switched over to the bump map. I'm trying to change the brush size. I hit the B key and this changes this over to the bump map. So change it back to color. And I'm just going to come back here, maybe drop the opacity, and just kind of just mess up the path a little bit. It doesn't have to be super fine detail. Basically, we just want some variation of the edges of the pathway so the mesh network isn't just so stark black and white distributing and not. So we're just going to keep doing a few things like this. That's going to be our pathway. And we can always come back after we turn on the mesh networks and preview it. We can come back and paint this, save it out, and it'll update. So now that we have something that's decent, I'm going to go down and hit Save Textures, and that's going to write out, you can see at the bottom, saves it to your source images 3D Paint Textures directory for reference later if you need it. So I'm going to close that. So we have this texture. Now we need to assign it to the mesh networks to indicate that we do not want the mesh to distribute where this texture is black. So I'm going to come back into, I can turn that off there, the default shader here. And the place we're going to do that, I'll start with the wild grass, is in the visibility node at the very top. We've already enabled Frustum Filtering, but we actually have we can plug in a map up top here in combination with that. So in the Hypershade, here's our texture that we just painted. I'm going to plug this right into the strength map. And you can see it updated, but it changed my selection. So if I go back to the visibility, it plugged into the strength map, and you can see that it actually already is working. Now, right now, by default, this is just projecting this texture from the y-axis, but we actually want to use UVs, and to do that, we need to tell it which geometries UVs to use. So we're going to plug in the ground paint transform node into this map helper. So with that said, we can actually see that it's working quite well. We're not getting plants, wild grass distributed on the areas that are black in our texture. So I'm going to go through and do that exact same thing for the rest of the visibility nodes in my mesh network, and I'm going to pause it and resume right when that's done. Alright, so I've gone through and just plugged in this color, or this map that we've painted into the visibility nodes in my mesh networks. You can tell that there's a map plugged in by this little icon on the visibility. Before it wasn't there, and then since we plugged in a map, you can tell that it's being driven from a map or an upstream connection. So this is cool. All of our mesh is now following the map that we painted, and we have this pathway. Now it's looking good. It's looking a little narrow, actually. I kind of want it a little bit. Well, it's up to you. Actually, let's keep it. I kind of like it might look a little more overgrown, like you could be walking up through a trail that hasn't been touched in a while. So actually, I'm going to leave it how it is. All right, so from here, I'm going to set up a few AOVs, and we're going to do some preview renders just to kind of see where we're at. I'm going to pull up the AOVs and add a diffuse, a speck, and a subsurface. Remove them from the Hypershade, and then we still have our painted ground visible. I'm going to hide that. And actually, before we do a render, I'm going to set up a shader for this, otherwise it's not going to look very good anyway. So I have looked around the Megascans library, and I found a good one. Trampled Forest Path is what I used in the reference that I showed you earlier, and it came out pretty good, a really nice result. So I'm going to use this one. We're going to set it up the same way that we did in part 1. So for this, I just downloaded the maps, and I'm going to go over to the Hypershade, and instead of walking through the texture setup that we usually do, I'm going to just run a script that I've set up. I just copy paste the file path to the textures, and it's going to set up the network for me. I'm still working on this script, or I'd make it available to you. There's some quirkiness to it that I need to get worked out before it becomes public, but it's a nice little time saver. So I'm going to assign that, and I'm going to just assign the displacement real quick. So this network is exactly how we set it up in part 1, with the textures provided for the soil, the trampled forest path texture. Now what we need to do, if I were to assign this, it's the scale of the texture is not going to be correct. It's going to do 1 repetition for this whole plane. So I need to actually create a manifold 2D, plug it into all of the textures so I can tile the surface appropriately as we're doing an IPR. So I'm going to go in through go in and plug in this manifold to all of our textures for this ground. And we're using the same manifold, so it's the same, you get the same tiling for all the textures. And I'm going to, I've already assigned it, turn back on my default material there, and I'm going to hit save. And in order to get this to work, usually when we're doing displacement, we need some subdivision applied. So on the ground geometry, I'm going to go over to the RenderMan tab in the attribute editor and add some subdivision. And the, let me think if you need, so then we might be able to do, or we might need to do the displacement bound as well. We'll see how it looks. So I'm going to initially, and what I found for these surface materials is the displacement of 1 is way too high. So I'm going to jump down to maybe 0.01 to start, and we'll take it from there. And then what I'm going to do is, to get a good preview without the mesh first, I want to get this ground set up. I'm going to add all of my mesh instancers to a display layer. My display layer. So I can hide them real quick. And I'm going to run an IPR and just see how the ground looks before I add the mesh, because the mesh nodes it's going to take a bit longer, and I want to actually preview the ground first. So with that, we need a light source. So I'm going to add a dome light. I'm going to add an HDR, one that I've picked, more of a sunset looking one. Most of the HDRs I use come from HDR Haven, free online HDR maps that are really nice. I know this is going to need a bit more exposure, and let's just save this and run an IPR through the shot cam. Alright, and this is what we get. This is how we're looking. So I plugged in the manifolds, but I didn't actually add any tiling. So you can see this is way stretched out, way more than I like. And also, just first look, this dome light needs to be rotated. I can tell the light source is directly behind me, and it's making it look super flat. So while I have the dome light selected, I'm just going to rotate it just like that, so I get some glancing light. And then I need to work on this ground shader a bit to get it to look a little better. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to the manifold, and the scale S and scale T, that's your UV repeat on this. I'm going to go maybe 6 or 7, I think is what I had used in the past. And then after you change this, it's going to take a sec because it's got to redice the geometry for displacement. So it's starting. We'll see. Again, it takes just a moment. Alright, so it's begun, and initial looks, I can tell the displacement is a little too high. Some of these things are jutting out a little too far. I think I like the repeat though. I'm not picking up any real texture repetitions visually, so I'm going to go back in and adjust the displacement amount from 0.01 to 0.007, just to tone it down a little bit. It's a little steep. I'm going to pause this while it recalculates the displacement. We'll look at what we... Alright, so starting to sample. It still might be a little much, but I'm going to leave it. This might be covered with some, pardon me, with some of the grasses. So I'm going to leave it at this. I like how some of these rocks are sticking up, and it looks really nice. So from here, with the IPR running, I can actually enable my mesh networks. I'm just going to click on the display layer for those. get it framed in here a little better. So now we can see them coming in here. And as they're rendering, we can kind of preview the channels or the AOVs. And I can tell, I mentioned this in part one, the transmit gain for some of these can be a bit high and it's looking a little fluorescent. I can tell that's the case here. But other than that, it's looking pretty good. So this is where we can go in and start tweaking the shaders for some of these plants. So I know for the, if I can kind of share the screen here, for the wild grass, I'm going to come in here for the wild grass shader and turn down the transmit gain on this a bit. I'm going to do the same thing for the swamp grass. I can do this while the IPR is running, which is nice. Looks like the swamp grass needs to be taken down too. So now we can see as it updates the difference. We can tell these fluorescent blades here. This is the subsurface AOV. It brings it down, I think, to a more realistic level. Perfect. Okay, so this is looking good. I do notice that we are, and I'm seeing patchy areas through here, so I feel like we need to bump up the distribution on some of these mesh networks to just bring in more of them. So I'm going to go in and do that, and you can actually do this while the IPR is running as well. It's kind of it's up to you. Sometimes it can get a little sluggish, and occasionally it can hang Maya, so it's always good to keep saving your file. So on the wild grass, I'm going to jump the distribution, and also I've noticed when the IPR is running, sometimes you can click on the mesh nodes and it won't populate. So you have to go down in the outliner, click on the actual mesh icon down here, and then you can toggle over to the connected nodes to the distribute. So for the wild grass, 10K seemed to be okay actually. I'm just looking around and kind of gauging. I want more of the swamp grass though, I know that. So I'm going to go over to the swamp grass, distribute. I'm going to take that up to 9. Let's kind of see how this fills out. See a few more popping in here. I can tell it's making a nice difference over here. Okay, that looks good. And then let's bump up the dry grass as well. I do like what it looks like. I want to bump it up and see if it's necessary. So a lot of it at this stage is just tweaking, like I mentioned before. You fine-tune the amount of nodes distributed. You can tweak the shaders, the camera, anything. At this point, it's just kind of tweaking. And for the purposes of my shot, I'm trying to keep it basic. So we're kind of closing in on the final look right now. So that's starting to look decent. One thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to cancel this IPR. I think this hill over here is kind of getting, I don't know if there's too much grass right here, but I'm going to copy this boulder over here just to give a little bit of dimension to this side of the frame. And then we'll see what it looks like from there. So I'm going to take the rock rib 1, and I'm just going to, in my perspective view, if you hold shift and move it, it creates a copy of it. I'm going to move it up here. Something like in this general area. I'm going to rotate it so it's not the same orientation as the first rock. And I'm looking at it through the camera. This particular, these grasses right here are kind of getting in my way, and I'm almost thinking I want to tweak the camera a little bit just so it's not just a straight pathway up. So we can do that through the shot cam view. I'm just gonna orbit this around and maybe take a different angle on it. Maybe something like this. And now the pathway kind of gets lost right there, so I don't know. I'm debating if I'd like it to be over. Kind of do like that though. So I'm gonna try that. So one thing I'm gonna do to preview is add some depth of field to this. So I have my object stats overlay on enabled in my viewport, so I can see that this rock is 524 scene units away from the camera. So I can select my shot cam, come down to depth of field, enable it, type in 524, and I'm going to drop this a few stops to f2.8 just so I can get kind of the focus here, and then it'll kind of blur off into the background. So I'm going to save that. I can't really see the rock here in the viewport, the second rock that I put in there, but I feel like when I render it, it might be okay. So I'm going to, again, kick off an IPR. Let's open this up. We've added quite a few more nodes to the mesh network, so that's definitely going to impact our rendering performance. And we've also added depth of field, which is definitely going to play a factor. So I am noticing some of these foreground grasses are being blurred a bit from the depth of field, which I like. The rock is in focus. It hasn't sampled enough to really preview what's going on back here. So I'm thinking that the camera might be a little bit too close to the ground. I think I want to bring it up slightly. I think I like that better, at least in the viewport. I didn't like how this grass was taking up the whole half of the frame. So I have left the primary visibility on my dome light on right now for previewing, just so I can get a better sense of what it looks like. But you'll notice my alpha's there, so I'm actually going to take this, and in comp I can put in a different sky. I like to render with the primary visibility on just for previewing, and then swap it out in post. So while this renders, I'm just going to pause the recording and we'll see what it looks like here in a minute. Alright, so I've let it render for just a minute and I'm happy with the results. There's a few tweaks I want to make as usual, but overall this is looking really nice. So I'm going to actually cancel the IPR just to make it a little easier to work in the viewport. So if we go back, if I minimize this, if we go back to the viewport, one thing I have noticed is when I throw in dry grass as part of the mesh network, it's distributed everywhere evenly. And really, in real life, you see more patches of dry grass, and it's not so evenly distributed throughout the green grass. So what I'd like to do is, part of the visibility mask is I want to multiply over just a fractal that will give it kind of some areas of dry grass instead of all throughout. So if I turn off, to get a better visual of this, if I turn off the other grasses and we look at just the dry grass, we can see it's really evenly distributed. But what I can do here to kind of make it look a little more realistic is, so here's the texture for the pathway. What I want to do is I want to multiply that with a fractal or some other noise map just to kind of tell the dry grass to go in specific areas and in clumps rather than all over. So I'm going to use just a normal Maya fractal, and I'm going to do this. So if I look at the frequency or the sample, you can see it's pretty high frequency. If I set this up now, plug in a multiply divide, plug in the out color into input 1 of that texture, the pathway texture. I'll plug in the out color to input 2 of the fractal texture. Now I need to go into the visibility mesh node for the dry grass, and instead of the strength map being just the pathway, I'm going to actually plug in the one multiplied with the fractal, and you can see the result right away. We do get, and I keep zooming out because of this, and this dome light is in the way, so I'm going to scale that up a little bit more. So you can actually see right away that we are getting more patchiness in the dry grass, which is great. It's a little too, the patches are a little too small. I kind of want bigger areas. So to do that, I'm going to take the place 2D texture node for the fractal and just reduce the repeat. I'm going to go down to somewhere like 0.3, 0.3. So now we get kind of patches here, and I actually might want to bump that up a little more, just visually looking at this. And it doesn't have to be uniform either. So I do like that. I'm looking both at the shot cam here. We have a nice patch. Play with this just a little more. I do like that. So we do get some nice patches. So I do tend to do this just to add to the realism of the mesh networks. Otherwise, everything is distributed basically evenly, and you're only controlling how much of it to distribute. Well, doing something like this allows you a little more randomness that you would find in nature. So I'm going to do that. And then one other thing I've noticed, I want my camera up a little bit more. I wasn't happy with, in my render, how the pathway, I'd like to see the pathway kind of trail off instead of get cut off. Now I could remove some of these grasses, but I'm going to just try with moving the camera a little bit more to see if I can get what I'm after. And I also want this rock to be a little bit higher. So I'm going to save what I have, and I'm going to turn back on these other networks. I'm going to preview what I have. I'm going to just run through them and make sure everything looks good. So this weed plant, I actually feel like I could use a few more of them. So I'm going to go into the distribute. I'm going to just go 400. Well, now I get one in my face, so maybe 350. Maybe I'll jump back up to 400, and then you can use the seed to kind of throw them around a little bit more. There, I like that. Okay, so this is a good way to go through and preview what you have. I think the periwinkle as well needs to be a little bit, there needs to be a little bit more of it. And I'm going to mess with the seed. Okay, I like that. So there's a few more on this side. There's a few up there too. I'm gonna orbit this camera a little bit farther down. This way, like that. Okay. Go down to my swamp grass. Swamp grass I feel like looks nice. I like that, and I feel like there's a good amount of it. But just for fun, I'm going to go and just see if I change the seed around, if I get some different looks that look nice. Actually liked one that I saw. That one looks good. Seed 6. Okay. I want to go down to the wild grass. This has got the most number of points. The wild grass got 10,000. And again, I'm just going to mess with the seed a little bit just to see if we can come up with anything more exciting. Alright, at this point, like I said, we're just kind of tweaking and fine-tuning. The last render we had was actually really nice. If we let it sample out, throw in a new sky, that's actually pretty close to final. So I've turned on the rest of my networks. I'm going to take this rock down just a hair. And since I've moved the camera, I need to double check the distance and my depth of field. So 526. If I select my camera, 524, so pretty much stayed the same. I never named this appropriately, so I'm going to throw this into my lights group. I'm going to save that. And the last thing that was kind of bothering me was these sticks. The displacement, you can tell it's displacement on just this asset part of the ground. All the rocks looked good, so I'm just going to throw an offset into the manifold, and hopefully that will go away. So I want to graph my soil, go to the manifold, and if I just do an offset of 0.5, that should actually shift away. Alright, so I think we're at a point where we can kick off a render and let it sample out and see what we get. And then from there we can throw in a new sky, or we can just leave it as is. I am liking the results that we're getting just right out of the render. So from here I'm just going to save my scene. I'm going to kick off a render, and I will come back when this has sampled out a bit, and then we can look at what we've got. Alright, so I've let this render for a little bit, and I'm happy with the results. So we can see a few things that we just adjusted that I'm pleased with. One of which is the dry grass, how we added the patches, kind of the fractal map to it. I like that you can see there's patches of the green grass, and then there's a dry grass area up here and a little bit down here. I think that adds to the realism, and I'm happy with that. I also like the camera angle. Right now you can kind of see the path trailing off, and both rocks look really nice. So the depth of field also, in my opinion, looks good. I like that it's focused here. Again, for this simple shot, this is kind of my subject, so that's good to have the focus. And then also the kind of the sticks that were on the texture that were displaced a little weird. The offset that I applied worked so that it doesn't show right here, and I still get a nice dirt texture here. So maybe taking this a step further, normally I would probably scatter a bit more debris on the pathway, maybe have some tracks of a bike or something through here to kind of convey more of a story, but for our purposes, I feel like this is a very good place to stop. I'm going to take this render and just comp a sky under it, and then we'll call this good. So from here, I'm just rendering it in the IPR. It's not sampled all the way out, but I'm just going to kind of take what we have now. I'm going to export the file as an EXR. So if I go here, I'm just going to take it into demo images. I'm just going to create a new directory here. I'm going to do the OpenEXR have no AOVs. I'm going to save that. So if I go in, and my compositing package of choice is typically Fusion, I'm going to load this in. If I go to my demo images here, and we can preview it, you can see obviously it's in a different color space right now. So we're just going to do a quick comp. I'm not going to do any color correction right in here, but we can just kind of see how it looks. So I'm going to change that to sRGB with the gamut node. We can see now in between, before you change the color space, would be where you would want to do some color corrections. I'll do maybe just a bump the exposure in the center, kind of to do a vignette. Sometimes I darken the edges, and sometimes I just lighten the center to get a vignette effect, depending on what it, the shot looks like. I can probably use a bit more exposure here, so I'm going to actually brighten the shot, but mask out the edges to kind of bring in some vignette. So I'm going to bring up the gain, and then I'm going to need a mask for this. So what I can do is use a background node. I don't want to merge it. So background node, if I preview it in the second window here, if I go over to a radial, I can zoom out here, we can get a gradient of black to white, and I'm going to, so this brightness effect I only want in the center, so I want to kind of invert this and take it there. And then I'm going to take the mask from the brightness node and plug that into the output from the background node here. So if I were to say toggle that, so one thing when you do plug in a mask initially, you have to go over to the settings, and by default it takes the alpha as the mask. I want it to be the luminance, because there's no alpha to this background node. This is just a black and white, so it's going to take the luminance. And then I can plug in another brightness here, and I can kind of boost the effect of this mask here. So you can see the difference as I toggle. That's the raw render, and now we've brightened just the center and we've darkened it, which leaves the outside a little bit darker, which is nice. So then we're going to bring in, I'm just going to bring in a sample sky that I have. If I bring in source images, I just have a panorama that I like, that I've used, and I'm going to do a merge. So the foreground, and since this panorama is in sRGB color space already, I'm going to merge it after I have converted the raw render to sRGB. So if I preview it now, it looks pretty bad. We need to do some work to it. So I'm going to take this and do a transform node, and we're going to scale it. I think we're going to scale it up a little bit, but we also need to move it up and over. And you'll see it's getting blown out here. That's because the merge is actually doing an additive merge. If I take that down, we get just a normal comp, one on top of the next. So I'm going to go back to this transform and move the sky. And if I maximize that a little better, move this over here. Size it up just a hair more. Bring this over. I feel like the sky should be brighter as well, so I'm going to add a brightness. I'm just going to put a little gain on it. Something like that. Maybe bring the gamma up just a hair to kind of match a little bit. Now we have a problem here, is that now we're not in the correct aspect ratio. So from here, I need to put in a crop node, keep centered, and if we preview that, then we get the final result here. So if I maximize this, we can kind of see a little better what we're looking at. So we can go back in and adjust the sky. I think I'm happy with where that's at, actually. Like the little sunset over there. Perfect. All right, with that, from here I might do a few more color corrections, but that's not really the focus of this part. But basically I feel like this is kind of where we'd like to conclude. We've stepped through how to use Megascans assets, how to set them up, how to use them in Maya's mesh system to create a scene fairly quickly. It really was a lot of repetitive steps for the different assets. Other than that, it was a pretty quick setup to do this mesh network distribution. We did some masking, playing with 3D paint in Maya, and then we played a bit with some different masking techniques with the fractals and so forth. So anyway, I think this is where we're going to stop. It looks really nice. If you enjoyed this, hit the like button. It helps us out. And if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, post them in the comments of the video. And until next time, I appreciate it. Happy rendering.